hasn't said of 12:30 yet. So afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar with the ISE. Really great session lined up for you. My name's Theo. I'm Chief Exec of the ISE, and I'm going to just kind of do a quick introduction, hand over to the team of panelists who'll go through the main content, and then I'll come back on towards the end and just field any questions from you in the audience. If you're back in the office, great to see you back in the office. I'm actually in ISE Towers today, so that's where I'm dialing in from, not from home. We're back in sort of roughly 2 or 3 days a week, so it's good to see a bit of normality coming back. But we are sticking with the webinars, because one of the things we learned through the pandemic is how powerful our network of webinars, how people really value engaging with them, particularly because actually they can go back and look at the recording if they miss it, or if they want to share it or catch up on something. So this webinar will be recorded. It will be going on our platform over the next couple of days once we've downloaded the recording, etc. So if you do want to go back and recap on anything we covered, or if you want to share the content amongst your colleagues and peers, please do. We do aim for them to be as interactive as possible, so please do use the chat function, use the Q&A function. Once the panel have finished their piece, actually Jenny's going to pull me back on, and I will field any questions from you as an audience. So as I said, please use the chat, give your comments, and put any questions in there for the panel, and I will keep an eye on those and feed those through towards the end. That's it from me, really. Just a thank you to Amberjack. We're doing this session in partnership with Amberjack. We have a good partnership relationship with Amberjack, so really pleased for the support that they give the ISE, and it's through working together on content like this that we can provide really rich, useful sessions for yourselves, like this one today, where we're going to be talking all about assessing neurodiverse candidates. And I've seen some of the speakers before, so I know we're going to have a really good, rich and interesting session. So that's enough from me. Really pleased to hand over to Jenny, who's going to kick us all off and then introduce everybody else. So over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks. Afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you join us today. I'm sure we've got an incredibly informative hour ahead of us on what I know is a topic that's gained incredible momentum recently. So I just wanted to start with some scene setting and with a quote that really resonated with me from an American journalist, Harvey Bloom. Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will be best at any given moment? I think this quote is suspected to be the first use of the term neurodiversity over 2 decades ago. And since that time, the world has slowly caught up with his thinking. Autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, which I think for so long were medical conditions sought to be sort of cured, are now seen as natural forms of human neurocognitive variation. But what has really caused the increased interest in neurodiversity that we are seeing today? Firstly, I think there's clearly an increasing awareness that neurodiverse individuals represent 10% of the population and therefore clearly make up a significant number of job applicants. I know I've spoken to many of you recently on changes that you can make to your selection processes to support these neurodiverse candidates, and how many candidates these changes would support. Well, the answer, I think, is clear. It's a huge number. And the reality is such a large percentage of the population just cannot be ignored. And so these changes do need to happen. We need to be able to now more than ever before access this hugely talented, but in many ways untapped talent pool. And I think secondly, there's an increasing importance rightly being placed on diversity of thought to engender more interesting conversations, ideas, innovation, and creativity. Another part of neurodiversity that has really increased awareness has been through well-known and successful neurodivergent people. So dyslexia and ADHD, for example, are shown to be overrepresented amongst entrepreneurs, a result perhaps of their frequent capacity for innovative and visionary thinking. So, for example, Richard Branson has really changed the discussion around neurodiversity by talking proudly of their neurodivergence and seeing it as a help and not a hindrance. We've got the likes of Steve Jobs, IKEA founder, some Dragon's Den, can all be added to the list. And it's clear that people with thinking styles at the edges can indeed achieve these great things. But how do we really address the issues of ensuring neurodiverse candidates are attracted to our organisations, are as successful in our recruitment processes as neurotypical candidates, and are supported once they join to ensure they're being truly inclusive? This is what we're all striving to achieve, but currently the data point clearly paints a very different story, as you can see on the slide. And to call out a few of these data points, just 1 in 10 organisations say consideration of neurodiversity is included in their people management practices. That's clearly not enough. Approximately 60% of people with autism, 55% with dyspraxia, and 53% with dyscalculia reported that people in their workplace behave in a way that excludes neurodivergent colleagues. And 77% of graduates, and I think I found this statistic most alarming, with disabilities fear they will be discriminated against. 72% worry they'll be a nuisance to employers. So it's clear that neurodiverse candidates are not feeling supported, both during the recruitment processes and once they've joined organisations. I think we're in many cases putting up unnecessary barriers for candidates who are neurodiverse. They're likely to be deselecting themselves from the process. Job descriptions might be too long, overly complicated, filled with overwhelming acronyms and terminology that can only really be understood by internal employees or those candidates that are really able to focus and digest the complex information. And when we come to talk about application forms and processes might appear too long and complicated with numerous assessments and hurdles that they assume they just won't be able to get through. They don't know what support will be provided. So as a candidate, they just don't try, they deselect themselves. I think there's clearly a lack of signposting at the first point of contact with the candidate. What support could they receive, and at what stages in the process could they receive this support? They might be overwhelmed or confused by the communication they receive. And finally, the way in which we're assessing candidates and training our assessors may not really be favouring the neurodiverse candidates that we're looking to support. And all of this, while there's no real black and white, the spectrum of neurodiverse candidates is huge. So we're sort of stuck with, how do we really cater for everyone? How can we make sure these candidates are supported in their job search and application process? And what can you do today within your organisations to address this hugely complex and incredibly important issue? Where do you even begin on the journey? I think that's what we want to come on to in this session. It will be a panel discussion to address these key areas. So where do you start? How do you build on the understanding what you need to do? What challenges might you face? Because you're undoubtedly going to face into pushback and resistance. And what can you actually start doing now to ensure that you're more inclusive, addressing the needs of the neurodiverse candidates, and then in doing so, enabling your organisations to be more diverse, to be more entrepreneurial, creative, and ultimately more successful places to work. So I'm going to pause there for a minute, really looking forward to opening up the conversation with our panel. I'll come on and let them introduce themselves shortly, and then we'll get going with the discussion, which I hope will really take you on a journey navigating through some of the problems I've just been talking about. And the intention at the end of this session is that you can really come away with a better understanding of how you can address the problem we're all facing into, and what you can practically do to start changing how things are done. As Stephen said, as we go through, please post questions in the chat and we'll come on to those. So I'll stop now. Di, you can probably stop sharing the presentation, and we'll come on and do some introductions. Theo, should we start with you?
Hurrah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Theo Smith. I'm the author of Neurodiversity at Work with Professor Amanda Kirby. I'm a podcast host. I'm a recruitment expert by trade, and before that, an actor, which I like to use in my current role as a neurodiversity evangelist. And I also work closely with the Dynamist group to help them bring neurodiversity to the top of organisations, to boards, to help them better understand how they can improve their work environments for those who perhaps think and act slightly differently to whatever the defined norm is. That's me.
Thanks so much, Theo. James, do you want to do a quick introduction?
I was really hoping I wasn't going to have to follow Theo, to be honest. Hi, yes, so I'm James Fellows. I'm the founder of the Bridge of Hope Careers. And so just a quick background. So I was born very lucky, had a very privileged childhood. I was in the same class as a boy called Cameron, who went on to run the country. And everything was pretty golden, to be honest. I went into the drinks industry and ran most of the biggest customers in North America for Diageo. It was about 2008. And what could possibly go wrong? Happily married, 3 kids, living the dream. And then everything did. I got sued, I got swindled, I got laid off, and it all unraveled. And so I had my first experience in this space by being sectioned for the foreseeable future in a psychiatric ward outside New York, which, in case you're wondering, is not actually hugely dissimilar to a hospital, apart from there's a very large locked door on the front. There are no shower curtains or curtains, which took me a couple of days to work out. And the windows are very strong. And I know that because I saw somebody trying to throw themselves through it. So I came out of the psychiatric ward, came back to the UK, and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I didn't even know what it was. But one thing I found out pretty quickly, once my marriage, my job and everything had unraveled, was I was suddenly unemployable. Nobody wanted to touch me with a 12-foot barge pole. In fact, the only job I could get was as a janitor in a frozen food factory. And anyway, I did that for about a year, clawed my way back into the drinks industry, and then I was made redundant one more time, 2018. And that's when I decided to, did I want to keep selling legal drugs or actually do something more meaningful? And that was the start of the journey to setting up the Bridge of Hope and Bridge of Hope Careers. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go. But thank you for having me on the call.
Thanks, James. Come to you, Chance.
Hi everyone, I'm Chance Blue Montgomery. I'm the Partner Support Manager on Bridge of Hope. And unlike James, I was born unlucky. I was born into a family where my dad didn't think I was his. And so I experienced a lot of physical abuse as a child. And you know, I didn't feel significant. I didn't feel significant at home. I left my family house and met some friends. They made me feel significant, but the byproduct of that was that they was from the antisocial membership, and it would only be a matter of time before I got into trouble, and I did. By the time I was 16, I ended up in prison, and by the time I was 18, my sister took me to a mental hospital because things had got that bad. And I went on sort of chasing my tail somewhat, trying to make some changes, but struggled. And then fast forward, my sister died of cancer, and I didn't want to talk about it because then that would make it real, which is the worst thing you could possibly do. Because within a year, my life unraveled and I ended up back inside one last time. But this time I said, you know, I asked myself this question. I said, do you like who you are? Do you like who you've become? And the answer was a serious no. In fact, I didn't want to live. I didn't want to live on. And so I was left with these choices, and they were to either not live or change. And so I threw everything and the kitchen sink and the neighbor's kitchen sink at change, and spent 3 years and 10 months in therapy to deal with some of the childhood traumas and to unlock some pain. I spent 5 years studying with the Open University to give myself an education that my childhood didn't afford to me, and done swathes of personal development programs. And then this beautiful day came where I was just filled with amazing ebullience, and the warm tears of joy just came flooding down my face. And it was because I felt freedom for the first time in my life. I felt no more emotional discombobulation, no more anger. I was filled with forgiveness, and most importantly, I was topped to the brim with self-respect. And I realized that my childhood experiences were no longer going to define my future, and that I'd finally become the person I was always meant to be. And that was the day when I decided that whatever work I'm doing, I want it to be supporting people similar to myself. I want it to be nourishing communities and so forth. And that's when I met James, and I was I'm asked to be a part of Bridge of Hope, and as their partner support manager. And for me, that was like an invitation to heaven, because now I can support marginalized and system impacted talent from across the board, whether they be veterans, people with neurodiversities, disabilities, age, the whole lot. And yeah, I can tell you a little bit more about my role on Bridge of Hope further down in the conversation.
Thanks, Chance. Thanks. Di,
Yeah.
last but not least.
Hi everyone, so I'm Di Crawford, so I'm one of the senior assessment consultants at Amberjack, and I've been here now for around 4 years, so I support and everything related to kind of assessment selection all the way through from application form through to online tests, video, telephone interviews, final stage assessment centre. So very much kind of business psychologist at heart. And kind of one of those key things from an Amberjack perspective is that we really do believe in individuals being progressed and hired solely on the basis of their future potential. And in kind of the context of today's conversation from neurodiversity, we need to make sure that those neurodiverse candidates are actually able to showcase that potential through all stages of that recruitment process as well, which is kind of why I'm here today. I do kind of really have a passion for neurodiversity, and I'm really excited to kind of talk through some of those practical steps you can take to ensure that the potential of those candidates can really be unlocked throughout the process as well. Try to keep it short and sweet for you there, Jenny.
Thanks, Di. That's great. I said to Emily that we should run a session on neurodiversity. Like Di, I'm passionate about making sure that candidates are really hired on future potential, and I think it's super exciting that we've got such an expert panel ahead of us this afternoon. So, without further ado, we'll get cracking. I think what we wanted to do was really open up the conversation with where do you start on this journey. Chance, you and James are doing some amazing work at the Bridge of Hope in terms of focusing on supporting organisations to access this untapped talent pool, gaining the internal as well as external support. Do you want to touch on some of the work you're doing and perhaps how organisations can really start on this journey?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I'd love to. So I suppose, I left my intro as, okay, I'm going to go and try and see if I can do some good. I didn't really know what that was going to be, but I had a pretty good idea. It was going to be something to do with employment. So I wasn't looking at neurodiversity, I was looking at employment, because I had a very linear experience. When I'd had a job, life was great, and when I didn't, it was beyond rubbish. And I didn't think it was just me. And so I was trying to see, what was happening within the third sector and the social care sector with regard to employment. So I rang up a whole bunch of charities, and I talked to charities, and it didn't really matter who they were supporting, whether they were helping people who'd been veterans or ex-offenders or neurodiverse charities, etc. I rang them all and said, what do you do? And I got a very similar response pretty well to all of them, which is, we pick people up, they've had a bit of a rough time, or they have some barriers to their life, and we kind of get them back, we re-engage them, we rehabilitate them, and we get them job ready, or we get them work ready. And I was like, well, that's brilliant. What do you do after that? And the answer was, we don't. And it was 38 out of 38 CEOs of these charities basically said the same thing. Now, I'm not saying there are some charities who do help on jobs, but 99% don't. And so it struck me as a kind of a massive opportunity here. I was like, well, so all this incredible talent who are now back in the game. So if they've had trauma or if they had other conditions, etc., they're supported by wonderful charities. And the one thing they need to do if they want to re-engage with society is get a job. But there wasn't a mechanism to do that. And meanwhile, I came out of the corporate world. I'm like, well, my God, every corporate organization out there is desperately short of talent. And also, and this was just before Black Lives Matter, there was obviously just starting to be a huge push around diversity and inclusion, and they couldn't find that talent, or certainly that diverse talent. And so the aha moment was that there's a missing link, and why don't we bridge that gap? Hence the name of the Bridge of Hope. So we talked to a whole host of charities, and we kind of evolved, we piloted, and now we work with about 100 charities who have all sorts of beneficiaries and candidates, job-ready candidates who need work. And they're across the board. So we work with quite a few veteran charities, ex-offender charities, refugee charities, and neurodiverse charities, including sort of MenCap and Mind, etc. But probably if you said what was the common theme, mental health would be overriding all of it, because if you've been a veteran with trauma, or if you've been in prison, or you've been in a psychiatric ward like myself, guaranteed all of them have had some sort of mental health challenge or have a mental health condition. So that is a kind of certainly overwrapping pretty well everybody we support. And so we created a digital platform to basically aggregate that talent And it's 100% free to the candidates, it's 100% free to the charities, and they feed through job-ready talent and try and get them a job. And then we extended that, and I know you got Amberjack are obviously experts in early careers, to be non-Russell Group unis. So we work with 25 or so of those, plus sixth form colleges and boot camps, etc. So trying to basically help this incredible untapped talent pool that you mentioned, Jenny, into work. So that is our core model. And Chance, do you want to add a little bit more about the pathway? Because just a portal is frankly not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, when we looked at this, it was indeed fantastic that there was this pathway where these system impacted and marginalized groups could go towards employers who were looking for them. But yes, indeed, we didn't think that was good enough. We wanted a pathway that was nourishing and supportive the whole journey through. And so we created what we call the Coalition of Skills and Support Partners. And so, you know, for candidates who are ambivalent and not sure what industries they want to go into, they can tap their details in, you know, work history or not, and that will give them back a list of industries those skills are transferable to. We also have another stall with qualifications through the City and Guilds, so these candidates can access free qualifications in tech or construction or whatever, and various other pathways into hospitality and so forth. But there was some that was important to me because they were there because I thought it's really important to reduce the anxiety of individuals like myself. And so financial support was really important. So we have one store where our candidates can access their wages before payday. And why this was important was because if you go into a new job, it doesn't matter who you are, you're out of your comfort zone. You know, if you're suffering from anxieties or social anxieties and things like this, you know, having a utility bill come in while you're working your month in hand, your anxiety can really fly up. And so we put this in place so that candidates like this can just access a part of their work. So if they've worked 3 weeks, they can access 3 weeks of wages, pay that bill, carry on down the good path and show their best selves at work. And then we had a second one, which doesn't only offer free financial advice to the candidate, they offer it to the whole family. And why this was important is because if you're the one in the family with the earning power, if you're the person in the family that got a degree, it's not just you that got a degree, the whole family just got a degree, and everyone expects to benefit from that. And so anyone in the family that has any financial issues and problems, they all come to you and for you to sort out. And that could be really pressurizing for our candidates. And although it's an absolute privilege to be in a position where you can support mum or support your family and so forth. And I know this is the same for our first in family graduates. We work with 25 non-Russell Group universities, as you heard. And I know this will be the same. And so it was really important to me to have something in place that will alleviate that pressure. And it's that type of thinking that we have around our candidates. And yes, indeed, they have resilience and grit because we face so much problems and barriers in our lives. Our motivation has somehow morphed into a determination, you know, but we just want them to have the best chance and a smooth path.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chance. And looking at it from taking a step back to sort of from an organisational perspective and how you're working with organisations that are really making their first steps into attracting this pool of talent. Theo, perhaps I'll come to you in terms of some of the work that you've outlined in your book. If you're really new into this and just trying to, you know, diversity is no longer just gender and ethnicity, it really needs to encompass this wider spectrum and this talent pool. What advice would you give to organisations that are making their first steps?
Yeah, of course. So they've covered some really important things here that I'll just touch upon. Basically, neurodiversity is everybody. That's not undervaluing it, right? We're all neurodiverse. We have complex brains, 160 billion brain cells, right? So think about a thumbprint. Not one of us has the same thumbprint, yet we have 160 billion brain cells. That's how complex we are as human beings. But what they were talking about there is system impacted and marginalized candidates, right? So when we consider that around when we're starting something, when we're all thinking about what can we do within our organization, we first need to think about that very important point that Chance and James has mentioned there, which is these people have struggled throughout their lives, through the education system, employment, whether they've been in prison, whether they've come out without qualifications. You talked earlier about entrepreneurs, high proportion of people neurodiverse who are entrepreneurs. There's a high proportion of people within the prison system who are neurodiverse. So if you're used to breaking down barriers, if you're used to walking around walls, if you're used to being entrepreneurial, right, you will find that way to be that person wherever you are within your life. So if you've not been given the chance, as Chance mentioned, then you're still going to find a route and a way. The problem is that may find you in prison. So if we think about that, first of all, then we got to think about, right, what do we want to do? What do we want to start within our organization? Now, with that lens, we then understand that we need to enable people within our organization to start to have the conversation. We need to give the platform. This is just like many other facets and aspects of the things that we don't talk about, whether we've lost a child or whether we're in particular periods of our life where the way that our body works is changing, right? All these things that we don't talk about because we don't see or hear other people talking about it. So where do we start? We start by providing a platform for the people within our organization to have a voice. That's really important. The platform for people within our organization to have a voice. Because you mentioned 10%, I'd go much further. I'd say based on current data, evidence-based research, we talk around 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%. Throw that out the window. Actually, much more people are neurodiverse, much more people ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, dyscalculia, and on. So we got a high proportion of people within our organization that have been system impacted or marginalized, who are sat there today, who are not talking about it. My wife is not in her work talking about our daughter being on the autism spectrum and being ADHD and dyslexic and dyscalculia and wow, right? She's not in her workplace talking about that, because where is the platform for her to have that conversation? We need to think about that. So start with inspiring your workforce to know you care about it. This is what you're doing today, coming to this event, well done. Then you need to think about auditing part of your processes, and you can do that externally with support, working with internal workforce, and then talking to your people, giving them a platform, and it can be a safe platform at first to start having the conversation. And from that, you can start to understand where the potential challenges are, but also you let your employees know that actually you truly cared about this subject.
Thanks, Theo. Thanks. James, just to build on that and creating that sort of better understanding and working with your experience of working with employers firsthand, perhaps you could share some of those experiences.
Yeah, no problem. So I think I've just I always thought this about the recruitment process before I kind of got involved in doing what I'm doing now. Now it becomes even more clear. And it's probably for all the employers out there, have a think about your process. But, if you try to design the world's worst mechanism for deciding who to hire, you would really struggle to do worse than coming up with a job description, a CV, and an interview. I mean, they are absolutely horrendous as concepts, if you ask me. The job description is probably the least bad, but the CV is brutally miserable and is, backwards looking and highlights gaps in employment and, is very, very easily gamed, but is the absolute Bible and the be all and end all to 99% of recruiters. And then, you look at the actual interview, sorry, I get confused between the two, process. And that is, a brutal process that is designed to catch people out. So the whole way through, this whole system has been designed by somebody who's really good at compliance and risk mitigation. And frankly, if you can keep them out, they've done their job. And them being, it doesn't matter whether they've been in prison, they're neurodiverse, or they just got any asterisks and they don't fit the nice square peg in the round hole. So if the system is completely rubbish for neurotypical people, Christ, how bad is it for neurodiverse people? And I know, Theo's talked about this as well, but it's hideous. And so, if you're serious about this, I'd have a long, hard look about your process and how do you actually improve that? How do you make this friendly for neurodiverse talent, but also all sorts of talent, because you know, we talk to all sorts of agencies and employers all the time, and everybody's got the same problem. We can't find the talent, and we want more diverse talent. We can't find that. Well, if you keep knocking, you know, fishing in the same pools that 27 other people are fishing at the same pool for one fish, you're never going to catch it. So you've got to expand your thinking. You've got to start thinking about all sorts of other groups, and then you've got to really have a long, hard look at your process and say, okay, if we're going to seriously go after these other groups, and particularly neurodiverse talent, how the hell do we make the process work? And that includes also, should by God they actually get a job, how do you actually make them stick? Because the worst thing you could possibly do is get them a whole way through, give them a job, and then there's tissue rejection and they're spat out because your corporation doesn't think about how to accommodate them and make it work. So I'm not trying to frighten anybody. I'm just trying to there's a bit of a reality check that there is an investment of effort and time if you're going to do this, but the returns are phenomenal, and we'll talk more about the returns in a moment. But Chance, do you want to add your comments? Because obviously, you know, you've experienced huge barriers yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, I look at, you know, I've been doing some, you know, work with Professor Ashok Jansari, who's looked at, you know, how the effects of head injuries and things like this and trauma affects people, you know, and as a result of some of it, I realized that I've pushed through personally with thinking more creatively and things like this. And I like to sort of like talk in 3D or make things in color somehow, you know, and when you know, it's just about the whole mindset. And I got this great list to find that I'm a part of a wonderful group of people, you know, and the list being your Richard Branson has been mentioned, Steven Spielberg, Albert Einstein, Jamie Oliver, Leonardo da Vinci, Thomas Edison, Pablo Picasso, Steve Jobs, John Lennon, Jim Carrey, Jennifer Aniston, Whoopi Goldberg, Keira Knightley, and I'll include Theo Smith and James Fellows on that list, and of remarkable people. And I think to myself, you know, why would anyone wait until someone becomes that Richard Branson and say, we should have hired him, you know? And so bottom line in terms of thinking is, who really wants to be the person that turned down the Beatles?
Thanks, Chance. Just thinking about some of the challenges that organisations might face when they're making this transition and the journey to, you know, we've had some questions already, replace CV and interview, but replace it with what? And we'll come on and talk about that in a moment. But ahead of that, it might be useful if we can just signpost some of the challenges that organizations might experience. Some of, you know, undoubtedly they're going to have resistance, pushback. Theo, you talk about this quite extensively in sort of every section of your book. Can you highlight some of those challenges that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, of course. So we've got the challenges obviously candidates face, and that's there's a lot of information about that. But some of the challenges we face trying to come into organisations is there's often a lot of red tape, and often neurodiversity, it becomes this subset, right? It's a subset of disability. Therefore, often it can have a rise in importance within an organisation in the conversation, but then it gets pushed to a subset of another area. Which may be struggling anyway, because most organizations, you say they look at diversity and inclusion, which is about 80–90% of organizations, right? Only around 4% of them say they focus on disability. And then obviously neurodiversity is a subset of that. So what we've got to challenge is once we start to really get passionate and behind the idea of neurodiversity as a concept, we then have the barrier of where it fits in terms of, you know, HR policy, procedure, and all of the other things. And that's what we're talking about here. And if we can't get away with it fitting in, then it tends to get left out. And what you then have is a group of people who don't feel like they have a voice when you start to say, hey, we want to give you a voice, right? So the red tape is often, I find, one of the challenges and barriers. And I think one of the ways to get around that is to start to engage the workforce, I mentioned, and to try and identify people of influence who can support the cause. Now, often in an organisation, if we talk about 10, 20, 30%, and then parents of, it won't take you very long to find somebody within a senior position within the organization who is impacted in some way, shape or form, and therefore is willing to get behind this and have some level of passion, which is really important. Because if you can get that advocacy and that support and somebody who can be a champion higher up within the organization, it's much easier to get things over the line. So that's certainly what I found. But also, I think one of the challenges, people are overwhelmed often by the amount of things that they could be doing. So I would say, look often at the impact that you can have as an individual. If you find it too overwhelming, which is a difficult thing for somebody who's ND as well, so you think, oh, that's me. I want to be the champion within my organization. And then you see like 1,000 things that could be done. You think, oh, I'm too overwhelmed. I can't deal with it anymore. So that's one of the challenges we face. It's for me, always break it down into bite-sized chunks, right? So, and I always say about a recruitment process, right? If we're thinking about the challenges and the barriers within the organizations, let's look at what can we take on as kind of a small little project at first, so that we can get a win, we can get some buy-in, we can present that back, then people can understand the benefits. And a lot of this, which we'll talk about at the end, but comes back to communications is a big key element of where we miss out here, lack of understanding. And this is also speaking to our peers and the people we need to influence. We will also have neurodiverse people across those streams. So we need to seek first to understand, right? Understand the person we're trying to convince, then to be understood. Good Covey concept on 7 habits of highly effective people, right? But it makes sense. We don't do enough listening. We get too frustrated by the red tape, and therefore we all end up walking out the room frustrated. So that's one of the big tips, is that understand you're going to come up against barriers, but to overcome the barriers, you need to actually understand where this individual is coming from. And they may indeed themselves be neurodiverse and face challenges within their role and their responsibilities.
Thanks, Theo. And it's just reflecting on what you and James have said earlier as well. Just, you know, that some of the changes that you make for neurodiverse candidates will also have a really positive effect on everyone. You know, not using CVs, interviewing in a different way, cutting down job descriptions. We talked yesterday in preparing for this session about you know, making job descriptions much less complex, and that will benefit everybody. So already you can start getting that buy-in. So coming on to, I know there's lots of, you know, how do I actually take the action, and that's crucial. That's really what we wanted to get to today. We wanted you to be able to walk away from the session knowing what you can do. We were going to be joined by a candidate who's facing into some of these difficulties and some of these issues that we're experiencing, that we're discussing today firsthand. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to be with us on the webinar. But James, I know you're supporting Casper at the Bridge of Hope and doing some brilliant work in terms of preparing him for getting into the world of work. Can you expand on some of the challenges that Casper's facing and what changes he would specifically like to see? Yeah,
absolutely. And just before I do, Theo, you should check out the chat. As your book agent, there's lots of discussion about it. You may want to chip in, and Chance. So we're helping a really remarkable guy called Casper, and very smart guy. He was a senior successful marketeer at sort of senior management level in big blue chips, and everything was going pretty well. He had a challenging upbringing. He had some physical challenges as well, and then he was also, more recently, I think 10 years ago or so, was diagnosed with autism, and he lost his job at a senior level from this organization, and he's been trying to get a job again for something like 6 or 7 years, and he's had just countless interviews and opportunities, etc., and they invariably got the whole way, and then it's or they really we really like you, but we just don't know what to do, kind of thing. But you know, one of the experiences, and I won't mention the name of the company, but you know, we put him forward for, and you know, I rang him up afterwards and said, how did it go? And he said, well, it was an hour and a half, or just over an hour interview, of which 45 minutes was just trying to find out why I had a gap in my experience between 2011 and 2012, and all they did was drill into that 1 year. And finally I said, well, because I was in a psychiatric ward, And then basically that was the end of the conversation. So, you know, I think, and obviously Casper can do a much better job of that, but that is a not untypical example of people. And I think, you know, we'll talk more about some of the different types of talent pool, but, you know, just autism, for example, I think it's only 14% of people have got a job, which is just terrifying. And we'll come back to, you know, where's the opportunity there in a moment, but hopefully that answers the Casper situation.
Yeah, thanks, James. Di, do you want to come in and talk from an assessment perspective? Clearly, there's a lot we can be doing to make our processes much more accessible and inclusive, right from the beginning of the process all the way through to offer. Do you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, can do, Jenny. I'll try and keep it succinct. I could probably sit here for a good hour or more and talk through many different practical implications we can put in. But if I kind of start off and kind of go back to what I was talking about when I was kind of introducing myself around our belief at Amberjack, particularly around that progressing and hiring individuals based on their future potential, and obviously creating those assessment tools that can really enable candidates to unlock that potential throughout the process. So actually what it is really looking at those tools and the processes as overall to make sure that there aren't any blockers there, which I think, having listened now to Theo, to Chance, to James, as we've been talking through, I think we're starting to understand a lot of those hurdles even before we're entering those processes and kind of as you're starting to go into them. So what I'm going to do is kind of talk through that recruitment cycle all the way through from application form to assessment centre and try and highlight some quick wins that you can hopefully implement relatively easily. There might be some others that are more longer term goals for you that will require more actions and kind of more strategic thinking about as well in the background. But I think the one important thing to remember is kind of as I'm talking through those changes do need to be made right across that whole recruitment process. What you don't want is a really inclusive application form, but then set these candidates up to fail with assessments that are less inclusive, and then vice versa. You don't want to have really inclusive assessments and put all your effort in there, but not have an inclusive assessment application form, which puts all of that effort to waste if these candidates aren't even able to make it into the process itself. So I think that is one of the key things, is to kind of look at it end to end to make sure you get those candidates all the way through to offer. And then to James's point as well, there is that investment once in role to make sure that you can really support those candidates as well. And it doesn't just stop at that point of offer to say you have the role. So I think if we start off at that kind of application form piece, and I know, Jenny, as well, you've mentioned a little bit about this as you've been talking through there in terms of the amount of content that can be put into these forms. It can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot of probably instructions in there, there's a lot of lengthy questions. And I think that's probably one thing I would say to start thinking about is how much upfront detail and messaging are you providing to candidates at the start as well. So do you have a lot of detailed written content out there, potentially outlining the process, for instance, the different steps they're going to go through? And actually, a really quick win here can be to get somebody in your organisation to film this in detail, talking it through, and you upload it in an alternative format to digest. So particularly in the instance of maybe dyslexic candidates who require that additional time to read, and at that initial step, going through reading all of this information, they might well have just checked out at that point if there's an easier process elsewhere. You've got those candidates already locked in at the beginning. They can read, they can absorb that information much quicker as well. And that goes for any part of the process where you have that lengthy pieces of text, whether that be on email invites, whether that be instructions for online tests. Even in we've got one of our tools, so our HyperEye blended assessment, all of those big instructional videos throughout the test and kind of welcome and closing pieces are all narrated in a video. We also do have kind of subtitles or text only options. So it's all there in different formats and those individuals to absorb in different ways as they enter that test environment. So that's kind of a quick, easy win to do. You don't need to have a filming company do this for you. You can do this really easily kind of within your internal teams as well. So a quick win in terms of uploading different formats for you there. I think if we stay on that application form, another hurdle that many organisations probably face is candidates actually not feeling comfortable disclosing that they are kind of neurodivergent. So again, a recommendation here, and probably a quick win for you as well, is to review the messaging that you have when you're asking candidates about kind of disability reasonable adjustments. So really kind of making sure that you're expanding on why you're committed to making adjustments in the process, what those adjustments are as well, so kind of outlining at each stage. and that you actually really encourage neurologically diverse applicants within the process as well. And that's kind of key. And I think one of those other things that you may have just noticed there, I'm talking about adjustments and not reasonable adjustments. And Theo, all credit to you. I've read this in your book, and particularly taking out that word reasonable adjustment can be one of those key things in it, because actually what you're doing then is, or you're already saying to the individual, we've determined what is reasonable for you based on your conditions. So actually making sure the wording you have there encourages the open conversation with those candidates. Yes, you can then talk through to say, these are the steps that we've taken to create adjustments in the process. But what you're doing is creating the more open conversation with them at that point. And I'm sure we can send out some communications after this with specific wording. And again, Theo, all credit to you from your book in that bit. That was one of the bits that really drew me in on that one. There's some good wording there. And as Jenny said before, making sure you're really signposting at this stage of the process where those adjustments are being made along the way for them. And I think tapping into this piece around disclosure of neurodivergent conditions as well. I think having a look at what you've got on your application form, because that's typically where you're starting to actually get all of these pieces of information from candidates as well. So having a look what your drop down lists are saying. So are you just saying, have you got a disability? Yes or no? Do you require reasonable adjustments? Yes or no? Apologies if you can hear clattering. I've gone quite banging outside the wall with work going on here, so apologies if you can hear it. So make sure that what you're saying here as well, you're capturing specifically what those disabilities are. In the case of neurodiversity, you're capturing if they're autistic, they're dyslexic, they've got dyspraxia, they've got ADHD, etc. If you've got this captured in your ATS systems or whatever you're using, you have that information to hand. So at any point you're having that communication with the candidates, you can tailor your conversation accordingly. So before you start going into your seasons or going into your recruitment processes, you can have some of those tailored comms ready if you do need to adjust those at any point before you're heading into those conversations as well. And I think the last part to touch on the application form, and again, I'll try and go through these quite quickly, is the point Jenny mentioned around the number of questions you might have in there as well, and making it as quick and easy as possible. So short questions that get to the point are really the key here. So really those killer questions that you need the information on that can be really quick tick boxes or drop down boxes at that point is critical. If you've got long answer questions in your application form, can they be moved into video interviews, into telephone interviews, assessed in different ways throughout the process? So you're not using that information early on, and particularly those questions that are based on previous work experience, which I know everyone's trying to move away from in terms of focusing kind of, again, look towards future potential, not past experience. But I think we probably all learned today, again, listening to Theo, Chance and James, these individuals may not have had those previous experiences for all the reasons we've said here, from the hurdles of getting into jobs and different things compared to other individuals. So again, you're starting to introduce the bias in the process here and the hurdles for them to start to progress even from the get-go at that point. So I think there are a few pieces from an application form point of view. And I think if you start to tick some of these off, you're starting to make those strides to make sure those neurodiverse candidates can actually enter into the process where you can start to make some real changes as well to ensure they start to progress through to those final stages too.
Di, can I just invite James? James just had a comment on just taking it back a step. James?
I love what Di's saying. It's a very practical stuff. And I just wanted to chip in on the much higher level, really. And there's a brilliant bit of research that I'm happy to share with anybody. CIPD did on this and really changed my mind about the philosophy. And it's, you know, first of all, look, don't even think about this as anything altruistic. This is how do you get a phenomenal talent pool? And also, how do you build a team that thinks differently? Because even if you actually get diversity of gender, diversity of color, etc., if everybody thinks differently, you're still not going to have a very good end result. And so, you know, think of it almost like a football manager. You know, whilst Jordan Henderson would be phenomenal in all 11 positions, you know, no football manager would want one person to do all. They want specialists. And so, why are you not looking for specialists for your team as an employer? And, you know, maybe within that, you're looking for somebody who's going to be really, really good at focus, an operational person, detailed person. Well, why are you not looking at the autistic candidate base? Particularly now they can work from home and some of those challenges are no longer there. Chance touched on this before, but, you know, if you're in marketing services, you know, would you not be, or should you not be thinking about dyslexic people as a brilliant talent pool? They've spent their entire lives having to find ways around a particular problem and the education system, etc., and by implication are incredibly creative. And then from my personal, perspective as somebody who's bipolar, and if you said, would you give it back now? I'd like, absolutely not. I'd give back a lot of the problems in the past, but now I know I've got it and I know how to manage it. Bipolar people, and there's been a great book written on it about the founding fathers of America. And they looked, and a psychiatrist looked at it, and they came back and said, we're not sure whether it's 90% or 95% of the founding fathers from America all had bipolar. And the premise was you kind of had to have bipolar or be slightly nuts, because why would you want to leave your nice cozy farm in Cornwall or Devon and go to a barren land that had nothing and think that was a splendid idea, which I would have done, but an awful lot of people wouldn't. But so fantastic for innovation and, again, entrepreneur stuff. So it's really changing the mindset from the stigma bit and some of the challenges to, this is an incredible talent pool that's going to help us move our team forward exponentially. Let's proactively get after it, would be my observation.
Yeah, and it's that diversity of thought, and making bringing so many more diverse candidates into your organizations allows you to have that creativity, that innovation, and think differently. Di, do you want to finish? We've got in quite a few questions, just conscious of time. Do you want to finish the recruitment process piece, and then we'll take some of the questions?
I can do. I'll go through a little bit around online testing. I'll try and keep it a little bit succinct and see if we can touch on assessment centres. If not, I'm sure we could.
Actually, the online testing is getting quite a lot of focus. So yeah, interesting.
So if we look at that, so your cognitive ability test, your psychometrics, your situational judgment test, your blended assessments, all of that, I think let's firstly look at kind of why on the whole some of them may not be as inclusive in kind of standard formats that we might like them to be for kind of neurodiverse candidates. So I think if we take a step back from in terms of when the tools are designed, let's just take a situational judgment test, for instance, where you've got situations a candidate is likely to face in role. As a consultant, for instance, I would go and speak to individuals across the organisation and understand what good looks like. Now, the problem with that is, depending on the pool of individuals that we're speaking to, a lot of the time you might find that high percentage of those individuals we're speaking to are actually considered neurotypical. Therefore, the test content that we're designing and we're validating, so looking at how those items might predict in-role performance, is all against those high-performing, potentially neurotypical individuals in that organisation. So when you start to progress candidates through this test, you're essentially looking for kind of that cookie-cutter shape, essentially, of those individuals in the organisation that you've profiled against. So taking a step back from that again and thinking about a neurodivergent candidate coming through, their behavioural profile is going to slightly look a little bit more different, I suppose, coming through. So you might have them much lower in certain behavioural areas, much higher in others. And therefore, they're not going to quite so easily fit this cookie cutter shape that we're looking for in the process here. So it's a case of looking at the test itself to say, what can we do to this test to make it more inclusive for these individuals coming through the process? And there are some simple things you can do. There are some much bigger interventions. From an SJT item point of view, keeping it in the first person, so not imagine this scenario, what would X person do, bringing it back to the first person and removing any element of theory of mind. So that's kind of that capacity to understand other people kind of as well as you're going through this, and not what would this person do in the situation, but what do you do in this situation that's happening to you right now. And particularly for an autistic candidate, that theory of mind can be a real struggling point for them there. So again, a really simple change if you do have any of those items or tests in your process at the moment. Another one, if you've got numerical reasoning items in there, this was a big one. We did a piece of work when we were creating one of our online tools, HyperY, with Nancy Doyle. And again, there was a lot of bits that came out of this and a few bits that we're talking through here as well. And particularly one of them was around numerical items and what we'd call red herring information in there. So information that you might not need to use in that item to get to the correct answer. That can actually be a blocker or a distraction from calculating the answer for some of these individuals. So a couple of ways to look at it: remove that noise from the item and only leave in what's needed, or adding simple statements at the start of items, highlighting that some of that information is additional. If it's formatted in a way that is what it would look like in role, so again, some of the ones we designed look they're in an email inbox format, so it's as if the content has been brought in there from tables or taken from an Excel spreadsheet and put in there. It's what you would face in role. So again, just highlighting that some of the information might not be needed as well can box some of those pieces off there. And I think one of the big ones that came out of that conversation that we had with Nancy Doyle was around the forced choice responses. So again, it comes back to that cookie cutter approach. So in any of these online tests, it's usually tick box responses as candidates are going through. And again, that's all driven off the profile that we've reviewed against for those, in the most part, high percentage neurotypical individuals in the organisation that we've spoken to. So a key feature here, and it's something that we're looking at within Amberjack itself at the moment, is around for those neurodiverse candidates coming through the process, is allowing them to have a manual response instead of a forced choice response. And I think this here allows them to actually write their own response. So if a response is written in a way which is not how they would respond to that situation, might do it very similarly, but in a worded a different way, they have the option to phrase it in their own way, and that has the manual review in the background. And I can see a lot of people in the comments are talking about neurodivergent candidates don't need to be disclosing that at the start, but these are the types of you can have these versions of the tests that are implemented for these individuals to go through, which makes it a smoother process that you wouldn't implement for all candidates going through. So particularly here, you wouldn't have, if you have a high volume process with 5,000 candidates or more, you can't be looking at those individual responses, but we can be making those changes where we need to and make adjustments for those individuals who have flagged that at the start of the process. And I think
there was a question, Di, sorry, there was a question on general views of psychometric testing. Yeah. You're looking at specifically SJTs there. Theo, do you have any thoughts on psychometric testing? Candidates' feedback clearly not positive. Neurodiverse candidates' feedback is largely not positive, irrespective of whether it's timed or not. Any views on what organisations could be doing instead, or should they be using psychometric testing to assess neurodiverse candidates?
So a lot of it is around choice and the lack of choice. So organisations are often forced down a single route. So you decide you want to do psychometric tests, you get sign off, you get budget, you go and look at what you can implement in terms of technology, and then you, because of price, because of budget, you go with volume. So, you've got 10,000 hires that you're going to make, and therefore what technology can give you a reduction based on 10,000 hires, and you go and pick a technology on that basis. We've got a real problem with a lack of, we need to democratize that process effectively, because we're forcing organizations down a single path, and clearly a single path doesn't benefit candidates, right? It benefits organizations based on price and simplicity of process. From their perspective, it's back to the old decisions that we make across organizations all the time, right? And it's really difficult for them to communicate, a HR team or whatever, to go and say, actually, we need to have 3 different or 4 different types of technology and process that candidates can have choice around, or that we can support the candidates around selecting the right choice, the right path for them, because they may read slower, they may prefer video content, they may like gamified assessment because they're used to using games, their brain may work better in that way. But this is the challenge we got. So we need to think about design, like a universal design that supports all candidates, right, through choice. And we talked about it, Dan talked about it, communication is key, and we can learn a lot from communication, right? Algorithms, numbers are like letters and words, right? It's no different. The letters we pick are very important, the numbers we pick are very important, and how we build them are very important. And we have to think the same around the way that we assess candidates through technology or whatever it may be. Because from my child the other day who did an ADHD assessment, most of that assessment that had a camera looking at her and she had to focus on pressing the button when the dot came up or whatever, most of her focus afterwards that she talked to me about was listening to the car outside and wondering around what that funny thing was on the wall. And there was a funny carpet and a funny feeling. Now you imagine candidates in that process, you're trying to assess them, right? And they got ADHD, they can't focus on this thing that you're trying to make them focus on, and therefore it skews all of those results. So when we talk about psychometrics not working, like fundamentally it's not working on many levels, because the individual in the room has an inability just to focus on what you need them to. Therefore, you need to give them additional time, different process, different way, as Di mentioned. So, you know, it's breaking those things down rather than going, oh, it's easier if we just have this single defined process that we squeeze everyone through because it's more cost effective and it's easier for us as an employer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's exactly what Di was saying with the different pathways that you can have. I'm conscious that we're on 1:30, Stephen. I think we could carry on talking for hours. Hopefully this is the start of many conversations to come, but I don't know if we're closing now, whether we want to hold on for 5 minutes. Stephen,
I think we've covered every question really. I've been keeping track of the conversation, and I'll be going through. There's lots of really great comments on there, lots of great links, lots of people talking about you know, agreeing what they've said and different thoughts and different ways of improving. Somebody's Claire put a comment about how they work with the DWP, and that was very productive. Janet talked about the importance of work experience. So, but the actual questions that have gone, I think they've gone through. I mean, the one thing that listening to all this, it did strike me as part of this is still wrapped into that need for early talent to still get that business case, because I reflect, I put a comment in there about, you know, how interviewer training is just woeful now compared to what it used to be. You know, it's quick online courses, and listening to some of the comments about really bad interviewers. You know, if you don't train your interviewers on a pass or fail course, you're going to have bad practice. So, and it was also striking me as you know, winning that argument, you know, against risk-based decisions where organisations are too risk averse still, or reluctant to invest the cash they need to do all the stuff we're talking about. So yeah, that was my reflection. We need to get a lot more in that kind of space. I mean, the good, well-resourced employers do a lot of this stuff, always looking to do it better, but actually there's so many organizations that don't even touch the surface on this. I think a lot of that argument still needs to be won.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Stephen.
So sorry, go on, Jenny.
No, I was literally just going to close. I think a huge thanks to our panelists and to you, Stephen, at the ISE for partnering with us on this. I think the start, as I was saying, of many more conversations, and we'd be really interested to hear from you as the audience on, you know, what you want us to focus in on next. Is it the upfront attraction, and how do we do that? Is it more on assessment? Is it more on testing? We could probably run a session alone on your psychometric testing assessment. So what we are planning on doing is setting up a neurodiversity hub, which will provide a huge amount of resources which we can share with you. Keep on adding to. So yeah, really thanks very much to everyone. Thanks for attending, and the start of many more conversations to come. I think we did have the email and contact details of the panelists today to share, so we can put those on the hub and email that round as well.
Fab. And we'll email a link when we see the actual recording. So yes, if you want to recap anything, you can do. It'll be, I think you put it on your website, so it'll definitely go on the IC webinar library. So please do share. I noticed somebody asked about the number of participants, and you know, we've had a good attendance for this, and people have stuck with it. That's always my measure. But also often double, triple the number of people actually who view it in the moment also go on to watch it afterwards. So I think the more that we can share this content, the better, and spread the word. Yeah. Great session, everybody. Thanks. Really interesting, engaging content. Lots of amazing stories. I'm sure we could double or triple the length of the webinar, I think. So we'll definitely have to come back to this at a future date. And thanks, Jenny and Amberjack, for helping bring this to us. Really very much appreciated.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of the day, everybody. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.